going on in your groups, and I'll be curious to see a bigger picture when we get to share some of the ideas we came up with here. So let's hear a paraphrase or two. Who'd like to share a paraphrase? And if you just raise your hand or put in a gesture, you're kind of small to me, so it may be hard for me to see you. But who'd like to volunteer for the first paraphrase? Okay, I think Taylor has a hand up.
Okay, let's see. We just had it up. Okay, so for my paraphrase, I did it very brief, but I said active learning lecture formats can increase the success of all students in college compared to traditional lecture formats.
Great, thank you. Okay, good one. Let's hear another paraphrase. Mike.
Article details reasons why college lectures may not be fair to students from poor or minority communities that have not had the background to understand all of the content. Lectures are not active, so do not encourage active participation to engage students in learning.
Okay, thank you. How many of you found this to be either a new insight or a validation of your own experiences as a college student?
Both.
Okay.
Validation.
Yeah, okay. And I think this goes for, while the article focuses on minority or socioeconomically disadvantaged students, I think that there's an application that can go much more broadly when you really think about it. Okay. Let's hear a word that you chose. And if you have the same word, would you put up a reaction or wave your hand so I can get an idea of the frequency of the words? So who'd like to start with a word? Cassandra.
The word that I chose is belonging. And I chose this word because as I was reading it, I kind of got like this sense of like what I'm doing in my classroom is good and it's not just a waste of time. Because what I do at the end of every class for the last 5 minutes, my students present a presentation that they created at the beginning of the semester. So that I and the rest of their classmates could get to know them a little better.
Great idea. And, you know, how many of you also had that word? I know a few of you did. Yeah. This is something that sometimes gets underemphasized at the secondary level. We're going to spend some time going through how to enhance a sense of belonging in secondary classrooms, particularly as a more crucial need now than ever, given what kids are coming off of over the past few years. The whole socialization for learning is something that can't be understated. Okay, thank you. Let's hear another word. Who'd like to share another word? Okay, Elizabeth.
I chose background knowledge because it's kind of the like centerpiece against the argument for lecture learning, because it seems to be an easier way to learn for those who have the background knowledge, and it makes those who do not have that background knowledge struggle more, and that kind of causes that discrimination that like the lectures provide, and why we should switch to a more active learning environment.
Mm-hmm. I hear an echo of spider webs in there too from our last week's Quick Write. Again, and this is a theme that'll be coming up more and more as we get into the strategies about the idea of accessing prior knowledge and activating schema to give more access to the material. Okay, thank you. Let's share another word. Who has another word? Okay, Kalia?
All right, so one of the words I chose was achievement gap. I thought this word was significant because of the statistics that were found about active learning closing achievement gaps. So for instance, the Black-White achievement gap was halved and the achievement gap was closed for first-generation college students and students from families with a history of college attendance. when active learning approaches were used in lectures. It was also shown that low stakes quizzes increased attendance and test scores. So the achievement gap was closed by about 50%.
Mm-hmm. Good. How many of you chose achievement gap as one of your words as well? Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Let's go to one more word. Who has a word they'd like to share and throw out there? Okay, I think Leah has a hand up, and we're awake now, right?
Yes,
Okay.
she's kind of awake.
Okay.
So I chose, and I know someone in my group chose this word as well. Was privileged, and I chose this word because I've heard a great deal of debate about how far-reaching privilege is, how it relates to things when it comes to social issues, and I just found it very interesting to even think that, you know, when we're speaking about teaching strategies and we're speaking about learning, that privilege, you know, is something that we have to even think about in terms of that. So I just found that was very interesting. It struck me. So I chose, that was one of the words I chose.
Okay, thank you. Did anybody, I know some people did, can you talk about the flipped classroom? How many people chose that one? Okay. Somebody care to share what their thoughts were about that? Mike?
Yeah, I had a class that was flipped. It was a political science class, and it was great because the lecture was recorded. So we watched the lecture and did the assignments ahead of time. And then in the actual lecture, which had over 100 people in it, we could have discussion and be a little bit more active. Still not as active as a small classroom, but kept the 100-member lecture hall from just being us sitting there listening to, you know, a 2-hour speech.
Mm-hmm.
So I enjoyed it a little bit more than some other classes.
Okay. Anybody else? Thoughts about flipped classroom? Mike, you had mentioned something. Thank you.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, Elizabeth, was saying she was thinking about moving in that direction, and I've been doing it for a synchronous math class I teach for the last year, and I really like it as a teacher because I can deliver that information without having to lab on in front of people or in front of in a Zoom class, and the buy-in was kind of intense in terms of the time that it took me. But now that I have those lectures recorded, I just keep using them. So I could spend a lot more time planning actual activities and engaging students than planning a lecture or having just simply lecture.
So
but the buy-in was intense, but now it's actually great on time.
Okay, so just to kind of clarify for me, so when you're you have the students look at something asynchronously, and then you come in to meet with them synchronously, and then do more investigation or more elaboration.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, well, or we go into breakout rooms and we do exercises that require them to engage each other and engage in assignment versus listen to me talk.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's a lot of potential for that. There are also some downsides that I've experienced when Santa Monica College started trying to flip classrooms as well. And one of the downsides was that, not everybody, believe it or not, had internet access, so they couldn't tune in outside of class. And secondly, a lot of them just didn't do it, which meant that there was a lot of catch-up that had to go on during the time that they were meeting synchronously. So I think there's a learning curve for the students in terms of actually using that kind of format. And of course, a lot of it depends on the students' motivation and, you know, their wherewithal to handle that kind of situation. But certainly, I think it has a lot of potential. And, you know, Mike, you sort of echoed that idea as well. Okay. Okay, something that'll cause you to ponder, appreciate, dispute, think about. Any thoughts on that second to last box?
If I could share, I definitely appreciated this article simply because in this article, like I consider myself all three. At one point, I was low income. I am a minority, and I am a first generation college graduate, at least in my family. And so I felt when I read this article, I felt very advocated for, and pretty much everything that they mentioned, from like being in a lecture hall and having or feeling that pressure of that environmental pressure. I don't know. I just felt it just brought me back to like my first semester courses at CSUN, like being in those big old lectures where just feeling uncomfortable and not actually getting or being as successful as I wanted to be academically.
Mm-hmm. Just thank you. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are first generation college graduates in your family? Yeah, I think a lot of us probably are, right? Okay, so some of this I'm sure hit home to many of you. Let's hear something else. What did it cause you to think about or appreciate, ponder, or dispute? Anybody have any thoughts? Okay, Taylor?
So something that really stuck out to me was when the article said poor and minority students are disproportionately likely to have attended low-performing schools and stepped out on the rich academic and extracurricular offerings familiar to their wealthier white classmates, thus arriving on campus with less background knowledge. And I realized that I was speaking to Giselle in my group, and she was saying that she didn't go to a school that really had the best education. And so when she went to like high school and to college, it was a little harder for her to understand things, and she kind of had to put in more effort compared to her other classmates because they already had background information. And it made me realize that when my students come in, they come in fresh from elementary school, and it's their first year in middle school. So I don't know what type of education they receive in elementary school. So I need to come up with some type of, like I do a pre-unit assessment, but some type of activity where I kind of know what we're starting with, and then that way I can differentiate my lesson to cater to their needs. So.
Yeah, I think knowing what our students know through formative assessments is where we begin to plan the instruction. And any new concept or idea or material that we're teaching can't really understate that. Okay, one more idea that it caused you to think about or appreciate or even dispute. We'd like to share one. Nobody has any ideas, huh? Okay, Leah?
One of the things that it made me ponder was, one thing I found interesting was that with the active learning approach, the achievement gap between marginalized groups closed significantly compared to other strategies that I've heard. As a new teacher, I've heard a great deal about the achievement gap.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of different solutions that I've heard to closing the achievement gap, but it always feels like it's at a snail's pace. So I found it really intriguing that with this, it seems like there are more successful outcomes and they are produced at a more accelerated pace.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I found interesting.
Yeah, I think the difference is that rather than trying to dictate any policy, this is really, in the weeds where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in terms of what we're doing instructionally. Because policy won't really get down to that level or up to that level, depending on how you look at it. So I think that's the difference. And so the question is, what can we do in our classrooms immediately that will help move us in that right direction of closing the gap. I think that's the important part. So in terms of implications for our teaching then, what are some things that you were able to derive? Mike.
So one of the things I mentioned in my group, I really like the idea of the active classrooms as opposed to passive. I teach music, and we're kind of taught that if we talk for more than about 45 seconds to a minute in between playing, it's too long, and the students start to zone out. And a lot of classes and a lot of subjects go way longer than that. So keeping everything little snippets of information and active in between, I think, is really, really helpful and could be applied to a lot of different subjects.
Okay. Remember that we talked about the attention span being about 6 minutes on a good day. So that means that we have to continuously watch our pacing and change up what we're doing. And of course, we can build endurance for kids to attend longer, but it does take some time. What's another implication for our teaching based on the article?
I'll add another one. So just considering the format of exactly how we're structuring a class.
Mm-hmm.
So to keep it, are we lecturing or are we doing something active with the students in terms of their participation or discussion or activities as opposed to just delivering information?
Yeah, we're gonna spend some time talking about how to set that up, and then we'll be starting that week after next. So that's a good one too. Let's hear from somebody else, though, who'd like to share an implication that you derive from the article. I know you all have them. Elizabeth?
I was the one who had suggested or had mentioned in our group that I wanted to try a flipped classroom to try and make it a little less me talking over all the kids and, trying to explain all the lecture throughout class and then only having a little bit of time to go over like what we're actually trying to learn. And I think it's just really important that I try and not make it so lecture based, because like if there's an opportunity for them to do more problem solving or to do more hands-on activities, then they're more likely to learn it than just like listening to me talk, because they don't listen anyway. They just sit there and look at you.
Well, the listening skill is something that we're a little short on quite often these days too. So understood. Okay, so hopefully you found this article insightful, and I'll be looking forward to reading your IQs when you drop them into the folder after class tonight. We're going to go ahead and switch gears a little bit. So you're going to need your reader, so have it close by. And we're going to go ahead and get started here. So tonight's theme is diversity and culturally responsive teaching, and this is really going to be our focus for the night. Now, I have to apologize beforehand because this little clip I'm going to share with you is set to music, and this tune is going to be running through your head. And you're probably going to wake up at around 2:30 in the morning, and you'll be hearing this. So I just want to prepare you ahead of time, okay?
Are a must to communicate, respect, and build up trust. Parents are partners in change. Build this foundation. There's no one how parents communicate expectations. They should always be learn that's they have certain biases.
Professor, you have to share sound.
Yeah. What's the problem?
The audio is not being shared from the video, so it's only kind of sort of coming through the microphone.
Oh, shoot. I wonder why. I can't figure that out.
There's a button to click when you hit share. It'll prompt you on the bottom left. It'll ask you to share sound.
Oh, I got it now. Okay. Yeah, it was off. I'm going to go back to it. Sorry about that.
No worries.
You know what I mean?
Think about your students and your classroom structure. Are they learning within a context of culture?
Different cultures may learn differently, so modify your lessons responsibly.
Cooperative learning, independent work, and other such strategies. Learners learn better when they're learning with some cultural diversity.
Student-centered is the type of instruction that allows culturally diverse students to function, cooperate, collaborate on school projects, a community of learners and mutual respect.
Socially and culturally relevant instruction. Relax. Have the students lead discussions.
Knowing, understanding, representing information. Explore the diversity, cultural mediation. Students need to know that there's more than one way to interpret viewpoints and what people say.
Stereotypes need to be deflated, just as public schools were desegregated.
Desegregated, just as public schools were desegregated.
We can shape the curriculum to be student-centered, culturally integrated, community-oriented.
We can build connections from culture to content, create a cycle of learning between both environments.
The textbook is only one resource. You need to access others to promote discourse.
Teachers, you need to truly care and show your students that you'll be there to advocate and to guide the way. You should also read this book by Geneva Gay.
Support an environment that's culturally responsive. Engage your students and become effective. Become effective. Become effective. Become effective.
Culturally responsive.
Like I said, that song will be going through your head. Usually the share sound prompt is on. I didn't know why I was off this time. But anyway, we got through most of it, so that's good. Thank you for letting me know. So just on a working definition then, culture defined by Jacqueline Jordan, Irvine, and Geneva Gay is a combination of a person's worldviews, beliefs, language, and values. Culture are those filters that help us as human beings make sense out of the most ordinary things. And if we think about schema and the whole idea of the spider web, certainly culture plays a part in that whole dynamic of the memories that we share and that we have. But again, we know that we have to be cognizant and recognize an environment as being inclusive, as we should say, in this case, exactly. The thing we also have to consider is that each classroom has a culture of its own that needs to be considered and cultivated and sustained. And when we talk about the classroom as a community, this is an important part of how we create that inclusivity and get everybody engaged and involved in what's going on in the classroom. So as secondary teachers, sometimes we don't take time to really create that sense of identity in our classroom, and I think that in terms of the social component of learning, it's even more critical today than it has been in the past. We don't want our students to be, in a sense, passive in the classroom. We want them to be active participants. And then another part of it, too, is understanding our own sense of bias. I think somebody in the discussion said that we start formulating biases when we're like 5 years old. But knowing our own and being in touch with our own biases can also guide us in terms of how we engage our students as well. Now, Alex Pate wrote a book called The Innocent Classroom. I attended a session from him, and it's sort of interesting the way he perceives things. What he talks about is the idea of guilt, which is the cumulative impact of narratives and stereotypes that influence behavior and ways of being. I think what he's talking about here is a sense of the experiences and our backgrounds that we come to school with, or to any kind of organization or any kind of structure. So when he talks about the innocent classroom, this is the way that he describes it. And his choices of words are kind of interesting, a little bit different. He says race itself is not negated or demonized, but celebrated. In other words, everybody's accepted. And I think this is important because I know that I've heard teachers say in my years of experience, well, my classroom is colorblind. We don't recognize any kind of different race or culture. We're all the same. But that's really denying somebody's whole life experience. And I don't think that it is something that's beneficial to students. Another factor, he says, is your students care about what you think of them, and you care about what your students think of you. So in other words, do I have a reflection on how my students see me? And more importantly, how do I want them to see me? The students trust us and believe that we know them and also their challenges. And we believe that they come ready to learn from us. And again, they expect to learn from us. So the question he poses is, how can teachers come to know their students well enough to construct an environment that encourages the fullest engagement for the most? And again, he uses the word wounded, but I think he describes wounded as somebody who has been stereotyped and they live in a world of low expectations. I think that's the way he would interpret that. So the principles of culturally responsive teaching include these ideas. First of all, we promote and model a positive disposition toward diversity, realizing that the more diverse our classrooms are, that the more assets we have in terms of working with our students, that we recognize and leverage cultural and experiential backgrounds. And in that case, students of all different avenues of culture and language and religion are welcomed and feel comfortable in our classrooms. In that sense, we value language diversity and address language status so that we don't see it as deficient, but we are able to build on it. And again, the cultivation and development of academic English, which in a sense is a big neutralizer because that's the goal for everybody, right? To be able to become more proficient with academic language. So culturally and linguistic diverse learners are often caught in a cycle of school failure that contributes to their marginal achievement and high dropout rates. And this, I think, is attuned to what we talk about with respect to the achievement gap. Oftentimes, they'll be placed in low ability groups. And when I started teaching, we were still tracking kids in terms of their performance. And low ability groups, we had a lot of minority students in our low ability groups, and they stayed there for the course of their school career. They tended to get a watered down curriculum. I think Common Core has pretty much eliminated that, given that we are able to give them access to grade level texts as part of that change. A lot of their school experiences included failure and disconnectedness, where students felt marginalized. And again, as one of the byproducts of that, there's resistance to reading and writing in academic contexts. And part of this is a second language issue where affective filter is high, or it could even be a dialectal interference aspect where affective filter is high too. So I'd like to share one of my Tiffany epiphanies with you. This was kind of one of my experiences when I was a reading coordinator at an inner city school in LA. And my job when I was first brought into the school as reading lab coordinator, my job was to go around to all of the 10th grade remedial, because that's what they were labeled, classes, and give a reading test. And then once I scored the test, I would come to each classroom and I would pull out the kids that had the lowest scores and place them in the reading lab. I was like the Grim Reaper of literacy in that sense, because I would come in and the cold finger of my pointing to them to say, come with me, would be where we would go to the lab. And that was my first year, and so I couldn't really change much. I didn't think it was an effective way to do things, but being the new guy, I couldn't really make any changes. I changed them the next year. But I went to this one teacher's room, and there was a young lady there named Tiffany. He didn't know, and she didn't know anything about me coming to the room. So when I walked in, the teacher said, "Oh, hi, Ron." And then he looked over at Tiffany and said, "Tiffany, come down to the front here and bring your books," which is never going to be good news, because this kid had just entered 10th grade, and now something's happening with her class. So she comes down to the front, and he said, "Tiffany, you're going to be going to the reading lab." And she looked at him, and she looked at me, and she looked at him, and she said, "I ain't going to no reading lab." And the teacher, kind of was taken aback, but then he ceremoniously looked at me and said, "Well, Ron," and handed it off to me completely. So I said, "Well, Tiffany, we have this reading lab, and you're going to be a part of it." And she said, "I ain't going to no reading lab. I got A's and B's in reading all through junior high school. I ain't going to no lab." And this went on for a little while. And then I said to Tiffany, "Well, I'll tell you what, let's come down to the lab, and I'll just give you a test again. And if your score stays the same and it goes up, then I'll put you back in class." And I remember to this day, she looked me straight in the eye, and she said, "All right, I'll go. But I ain't doing any more of that dog and cat shiitake." And right there, she had told me what her whole junior high school reading history was. Because if she was in a reading lab in junior high, then her reading was basically workbook based. See the dog, see the cat, right? And now she made it into a regular 10th grade English class, even though it was labeled remedial, and she wasn't about to give it up without a fight. And right there and then, really one of those things that I call it my Tiffany epiphany for a reason, because I realized that a lot of the students that had come from the school where she had been probably didn't engage in a lot of very meaningful reading experiences either. So there are going to be other Tiffany's out there in the same situation. Of course, I kept her back in class, and I never heard about her again, so she must have done okay. But that was one revealing thing to me in terms of Tiffany and her experiences. The other experience that I had was I was in my lab one day, and I didn't have a class that period, and there was a knock at the door, and I opened the door, and there was an 11th grade young lady there, and she said, "Do you have a class now?" And I didn't know her. I said, "No." And she said, "Would you mind if I spent this period in your room?" And I said, "Well, what class do you have now?" And she said, "Well, I have history." And I said, "Well, shouldn't you be there?" And she said, "Well, yeah, but you know what? The teacher's just showing us movies of the Civil War, and I'm tired of seeing myself every day as a slave." And I thought, wow, that was a very powerful moment for me, because it caused me to think about, not only Tiffany's reading class history, but also where people see themselves in the curriculum that they're studying. And if she saw herself in that way, and she felt that it was derogatory, she had every right to try to think about another option there. And I thought that was very insightful with these young ladies. So let me ask you a question. When you were coming up in junior high or middle school and high school, where were you in the curriculum? Where did you see yourself? Any thoughts on that? Elizabeth.
I don't really think I saw myself, to be honest. I feel like I couldn't tell you what I read, but I don't remember ever feeling that like connection to whatever we were reading or whatever we were doing. I just kind of felt like I was reading it because someone told me to read it or because someone told me to learn about it, but it was never like any kind of connection with me, I guess.
Okay. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? I mean, I know it's kind of a weird question because maybe we don't have that expectation that we're going to see ourselves in the curriculum. Of course, if you're like me, you see white people all the time, some living, some dead. But, I was represented in one sense, but not in any other. And there are other ways that I could have been represented in the literature that we read, or the history particularly, but not so. Leah?
Yes, I always, growing up in school, I always just saw just a very Eurocentric just perspective on whatever we read, what we were learning, who we were learning about. In history, it was very, to me, it was very, I mean, I just never saw myself in anything in history except for like the student you were talking about as an enslaved person. I never saw, except for during Black History Month, we would hear about, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And it was always in terms of the struggle, civil rights, which is great. But at the same time, I never heard or read anything that spoke to me and my experience and spoke to me or my family or my friends' experience as well. So it was very, I try to strive to do the opposite now that I'm a teacher, and especially teaching, teaching literature. I try to use a diverse amount of content that is not so Eurocentric.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Any other experiences that anybody can relate to? Well, let me ask you another question. Does it matter? Mike?
I think it does matter because, like, for example, for me, a lot of the stuff I read in school was, Eurocentric, and that's kind of who I am, but it doesn't really speak to everybody else's experiences. And so if we're going to teach classes full of students who have different experiences than us, then we have to understand what those experiences might be and what they might be getting or not getting out of what we choose.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, if you go back to the quote about, culture shapes our beliefs and our attitudes and dispositions, but we never have it appear in any of our classrooms. How do kids stay connected? I don't know. I mean, some of you out there have experienced, well, you all experienced junior high and high school. Were you anywhere in there? We have a pretty fairly diverse classroom here in many ways. What are your thoughts? Marisol?
Sorry, I'm like barely getting home.
You want to wait?
It's okay, honestly, because I'm pulling into my driveway. But my thoughts were just that I feel like students from culturally diverse backgrounds never see themselves in a really positive light in classrooms. It's always about the struggle, the poverty, the discrimination, and it's never about like inventors and people from different cultures who did all of these great things for humanity the way that we see with, white people. And it's one of those things where we know that those people exist, so why don't we talk about them more? And why does it always have to be such a focus on the negative surrounding, the poverty, the discrimination, everything? And I feel like that people think that that's the only thing that minorities can relate to, when it would be nice to be able to see stuff that just sheds positivity and gives like hope for the future and shows, you know, a really successful story of someone from the same ethnic background as you. And I don't think that a lot of students see that. It's just primarily white people who get to see that. So that was just a thought that I had.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, you know, that's important. And when you consider every single discipline out there has representation of a diverse group of people. And, you know, with a little bit of research, certainly these things can be shared. I think particularly of the movie that came out a few years ago called Hidden Figures, about the 3 African-American mathematicians and scientists that were responsible for the first, the first space launch that we had. And other than the movie, I don't know where anybody would know about that. But that's one certainly significant factor. But there's so many others, I mean, from every different discipline that we can think of that could be contributory to students' awareness and making those connections into the curriculum. What are some other perceptions that you've had? You have a lot of different groups in this classroom here. Anybody care to share a perception? Did you appear anywhere? Michael?
I'm well into my 40s, identify as gay, and in my high school experience, the representation was purely about the epidemic, and it was gay men dying everywhere. And that's kind of my connection. And I also, obviously, identity isn't homogenous, especially in my case, right? So I had the benefit of also being a white male, which is like everywhere.
Yeah.
But I do kind of can loop into that of like when it's so singular, it really shaped my thoughts of who and what I was as a high school student during that specific period of history.
Yeah, I can kind of relate to that. I'm a Jewish American, but we never studied the Holocaust. You know,
Did not. Oh,
No,
wow.
the only way I learned about it was through my family and through, engaging in temple. But other than that, it was never broached in any high school or junior high school. Now I think it's probably a bit more pervasive, but back then, nobody even mentioned it. And everything was just sort of like a list of facts about things that you were supposed to regurgitate, which we know is not efficient in terms of retaining information. What about some of you other folks in here who had any experiences that way? Leah? Back to Leah.
Sorry, I just thought it just made me think of this quote that I read from an actor who was in school. His name is Wendell Pierce.
Sure.
Yeah,
The Wire.
Yeah. And he remembers asking his teacher. I can't remember the subject, but he was asking his teacher what were Black people doing at this time. And he was fairly young, probably around sixth grade or sixth grade or something like that.
Yeah, I think he was in New Orleans too. I think that's where he grew up.
Yeah, and the teacher was like, "Oh, Black people weren't around then." And it just hearing that statement. The funny thing that when I heard this quote, and I was like, you know what? I've heard this before. I cannot register where I'd heard it before or if I had thought it, but for some reason, I just knew that was coming out. It was going to come out of the teacher's mouth, and it just reminded me of, going through middle school. I'd never heard of anything, except for slavery. I'm teaching middle school now. That's why it's kind of hyper focused on it. But I never heard about anything but slavery, and that was the whole culmination of the Black experience on this earth, you know. So, and I know Marisol brought it up too. You just only hear the negative. It's very, it's very sad in a way, because it seems like we're all listening now, and we're all learning that representation matters, and it really does matter in content when we're teaching content, not just in entertainment and not just in, you know, things we see on TV, but it does matter with content as well. And that just popped in my head, so I just wanted to share.
Thank you. What about representation of Latinos or Hispanic people in the curriculum? Anything there that you can remember? Marisol?
All I can remember in like K through 12 is honestly like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that's like it. I honestly can't, like, learning about the Aztecs and the Mayans, but as far as anything else, like, that's all that comes to mind. Yeah. I learned a lot more about it in college, but because of the courses I took and chose to take, but in K-12, that's honestly all I can remember.
Yeah. Michael, was that a hand up again?
This is a question, and it's just sort of a comment embedded in it. Like in mathematics land, like Hidden Figures is a great reference, but like there are full forms of mathematics that come from North America, indigenous communities. The Mayan math system is fascinating. And not only is it not in the standards when there's more obscure stuff in the standards than that, but I've been explicitly told not to teach it. And I'm just curious what the actual standards are in other subjects. Like, is it like mathematics where there are zero references, or are the standards there? Like, is it in the DNA of our state legislation that we're like, what are we meant to teach in the other content subjects? Because I'm not as familiar with those standards.
My hunch is that there's probably embedded in social studies and in language arts standards a reflection of diversity. But let me just also say there's nothing to prevent a math teacher from using or citing language arts standards in a math class as well. You know, math discourse is certainly part of the Common Core, and I could certainly make a case for it. But again, I kind of think what you've alluded to, it may depend on the administration and what their expectations are, and if they see a need for it. Because certainly, like you say, every single discipline has a whole variety of different contributors who are very diverse, you know, and that's what makes the content interesting. It's, you know, there's this sort of perception, I think, in a lot of ways that the curriculum that they're studying in the canon is all whitewashed, but it's not. You know, there's so many different influences in terms of every aspect of any part of the curriculum that it really merits and deserves attention. And I think I can make a case for that. Mike?
Just being someone who's teaching in the arts, because I teach in music, we have, I think it would be a good subject for a lot of people to look at, because so much of what we do is from other cultures. Yeah. So yeah, when we think of classical music, we're thinking of the German, you know, white guy composers, but like I teach a jazz band class, and that's completely based on African American history in terms of music, and a lot of Latin. So we have a lot of Cuban, Argentinian, Brazilian, and that's like the center of that entire class. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, and I don't do the visual arts, but I'm sure there's a lot of that they can be pulled from. And I think if people kind of look at that, they can find things that tie into that, which would be, it's kind of cool. Like I cannot teach that class in a Eurocentric way. It doesn't even work.
No, right. And say the jazz is the one true American form, right, of music.
And it's African American originally.
Sure, yeah. And a lot of influences from there, particularly Afro-Cuban and Dominican and everything else. Okay, I see Kalia has a hand up.
Yeah, just going back to like, I remember in elementary school being taught the missions of California, and I thought that was a really cool project that we had to do. We had to pick a California mission and create that mission, so kind of make it out of cardboard or whatever. We'd have to research it, and my teacher even wanted us to go like on a field trip to some missions or go visit the mission that we chose in California. And I just think it was like a really great way of showing the Spanish influence in California and learning the culture and like agriculture, architecture, stuff like that of the missions. So that was just like an active learning thing that I still remember from like 4th or 5th grade. And I don't think they're doing it anymore, but I really think they should.
Well, I can tell you, I did that in 1959. We made missions out of sugar cubes, and then we took a field trip to the San Fernando mission. The missing part of that equation, of course, is how the Spanish coerced the Native Americans and the indigenous people into building the missions for them, and and created this sort of slave mentality as a part of it as well. So, I mean, that's another perspective that's worth exploring too. Marisol, you got a hand up?
Yeah, well, going off of what Kayla said, they did stop doing that, I remember, because I remember being younger and both of my older sisters did the mission project. And I remember thinking it was so cool. I liked seeing, like, they were building the whole thing, the structure in our house. And I thought it was a really cool way to, like, incorporate getting to know, that part of history. Right. And then when it came time for me to be, I don't know if it was 4th or 5th grade, they, like, did away with it. So I never got to do it. And I think since then it's, like, teachers just were like, never mind. So.
Yeah, I think it uncovered some uncomfortable truths, inconvenient truths about some of the issues of California history. But again, that perspective was never really brought out much. Tiana, did you have a hand up? I saw.
Oh, nothing too important. I was just going to say, I remember my school took it out because parents were complaining because they had to spend money to buy the pieces to make it, but they never thought of any like alternatives for this. They just completely took it out. But I did go on a field trip, so that was nice. That was still something, even though they could have done a lot more.
Yeah, I think actually that was my very first field trip. No, actually, I'm wrong. In 2nd grade, they took us to a dairy. Why? I don't know. But anyway, they did. Okay. All right. So anyway, it's just something for us to think about when we're teaching, and where our kids feel connected. I know that some books will talk about Cesar Chavez and dedicate a couple of paragraphs to him and the whole, farm labor movement. But, I mean, is that enough? I don't know. Gotcha, Mike. I don't know if that's enough. Anyway, just something to consider when we're working with our students. But I thought the experience of the Tiffany Epiphany and the young lady who wanted to stay in the room was pretty compelling for me, and it stuck with me all these years. If we look at the diversity in terms of kids' books, you kind of see a reflection of what we're talking about, where we see that about 50% of kids' books feature Caucasian or white families, kids, whatever, with about 27% going for animals, and then about 10% for African American. And again, when kids are learning to read, one of the things we want to have them do is make connections to the information or the material that they're reading. So as an Asian Pacific Islander or Asian American, you'll appear around 7% of the time. Latinx, even less, 5%. And Native Americans, 1% or less. So you can kind of see the disparity in terms of where kids see themselves, and also in some of the portrayals of children's literature, there are colors associated with certain factors that may be counterproductive too. For instance, the ugly duckling is ugly because it's black. There's certain kind of subliminal types of messages that may go out to kids that we sometimes may not be aware of. Okay, would you go ahead and grab your IQs? We're going to do a quick IQ karaoke. We'll take the first 5 to sign up in the chat. So I'll open it up, and we'll see who wants to grab the mic. Marisol? Karen?
I'm pulling mine up right now.
Okay. I have room for 3 more. Hey, Taylor? We have room for 2 more.
Do you want me to start sharing mine, Professor?
Who is speaking? I can't see you.
Marisol.
Oh, Marisol? I'm trying to get 2 more people in, so let's just wait a second. Some people might still be bringing up their IQs. Okay, well, Marisol, go ahead, and then we'll see if anybody else wants to come in. I have room for 2 more. Okay. Tell us what page you're on, and also the edition of the book with your 10th or 11th, and then go ahead and share your quote. You have the 11th edition? Yeah. Okay. It should be on your IQ.
I forgot to write the page numbers, but it's the 11th edition, page 74.
Okay.
And it's in the very last paragraph. On page 74, it's the first sentence. I chose language differences should not be mistaken for language deficits among culturally diverse students. And I chose that quote because I feel like oftentimes in our society, people who have language differences, whether it be an accent, they speak in a different dialect, they don't have perfect grammar, whatever it might be, or like the most expansive vocabulary, they get viewed as being unintelligent in some way, when in reality, oftentimes those differences are because they can speak multiple languages, because they've lived in multiple parts of the world, or whatever it might be, when those differences really are skills, because it shows that they are able to communicate with many different groups of people, as opposed to someone who only speaks standard American English and can only communicate with people who speak standard American English. And so I think it's really important to view them as differences and not deficits, and teach our students that if someone thinks that the way that you speak is maybe a little different, that's a skill that you have, and you should be proud of it and know that that can actually take you a long way in life, because of the fact that you'll be able to reach more people and communicate with more people. And I don't think students are taught that. Students who have maybe thick accents or speak in a different dialect may feel scared to raise their hand and share in class because they're afraid of being made fun of, when I feel like as teachers we need to really place an emphasis on that's a skill that you have. You should be proud of that, and you shouldn't be ashamed of it or embarrassed of it.
Yeah, I think that there's, thank you. I think that there's a myth of the standard English form that we sometimes think about, but I very rarely find people who really speak in standard American English to the extent that it would actually be standardized in that form. We're going to talk more about that a little later on too. But thanks, that sets us off for where we're going to go next. So thank you. Okay, Karen, come on down. The mic is yours.
Okay, so this was from page 89, so it's towards the end of our chapter. And it wasn't so much a quote, but it was discussing one of the strategies. And it says that Betty asks them to create a poster to visually represent the main ideas expressed by the chapter. And her students use illustrations, color, and lettering, and so on to present the chapter's information in an inviting, creative manner. I liked reading this. I have a child that struggles in school, but not necessarily academically. It's more on the social emotional end of things. He is considered to be selectively mute, so he speaks when he wants to and when he feels comfortable. So if the assignment he thinks is too easy, he might not do it and he might not say anything. And it's very much, I think, the same way with EL students. They don't want to be put on the spot because they feel uncomfortable with how well they can pronounce a word or understand the material. So this lets students, regardless of how they choose to communicate and how well they can communicate, express the ideas. And then if this is done in a small group format, they're able to practice those speaking skills in a more intimate setting where there's only, 3 or 4 people looking at them and listening to them versus, a classroom of 30 students. It's less intimidating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it made a lot of sense. And it's an interesting way to think about letting students communicate the information in the way that they need to in that moment, and then you can build from there.
Yeah. I think too, for secondary students today, there's a lot of students who are afraid to speak up in class. In fact, I think our class is even an example of that. For some reason, there's a lot of reticence. Some of it may be related to language. Some of it may be related to lack of confidence in content. There's a lot of different variables that come into that. But I think it's important for us to create a climate and a culture in the classroom that's going to be accepting of the language that kids bring, and that every aspect of language that they have is an asset as opposed to a deficit. Okay, thank you. Taylor, and then we'll go to Tiana.
Okay, so the quote that I found was on page 65 of the 11th edition. And it says, when teachers use multicultural literature in the classroom, they provide students with texts that not only are engaging, but also recognize the unique contributions of each culture and the similarities of the human experience across cultures. At the same time, they help non-mainstream cultures and value their heritage and give all students the benefit of understanding ways of knowing about the world that are different from their own. And one thing that for my comment on that, something I noticed in my classroom was that when I give my kids a choice to research someone or to choose a role model, they always pick someone that resembles them. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, we did Hispanic Heritage Month, and they were able to pick someone with Hispanic background who's made an impact in the world. And most of them either chose someone who had the same hobbies, like they're a soccer player like them, or they sing, or they just chose someone who was the same gender. So, like, the girls were picking the girls, the boys were picking the boys. Mm-hmm. And students, they want to be able to see people like them be successful, because then that gives them the confidence that they can also be successful. And when you include different cultures and they're celebrated throughout your lessons, and not just Heritage Months, different values and beliefs are normalized, and that's going to allow less judgment, less bullying during your school in the school, because students are respecting differences. And you can still, as teachers, incorporate different cultures while covering your content standards. So, like, when you're showing a video, maybe include it being an African American scientist, because I do science. So maybe include that video of someone being of a different culture or different race, and that's going to make them feel inclusive. And it requires little effort, and it's going to really make their day and make them more engaged in whatever you're teaching.
Yeah, and I think one of the advantages of technology now is that it's so easy to find people that you can bring in live into the classroom to show them and give them examples, from different different cultural groups. It's at our fingertips now, which is certainly one of the benefits of tech. Okay, thank you, Taylor. Tiana, go ahead.
I chose a quote from page 6 on the 10th edition. It is a teacher's responsibility. It is a teacher's responsibility to develop a relationship that nourishes trust. By seriously drawing on students' interests and popular culture, teachers can make connections that demonstrate respect for students' lives. So, although it sounds relatively simple, I do think that this passage is extremely important. I actually had a discussion about this during my student teaching seminar class last week. We were talking about greeting students at the door when they enter class and how that type of interaction is the perfect place to make this kind of connection with your student. In my opinion, when students realize that we remember the little things about what they tell us, it shows them that they matter to us. I did an activity while student teaching like the second week of school, and I asked my students what makes them feel the most appreciated, and like 75% of them said when teachers remember the little things about us. So that really stuck with me. So like an example, if a student tells me that they've started a new TV series, I might ask them about it the following day, like, oh, how's it going? What episode are you on? And of course, it's important to educate ourselves about our students' cultural backgrounds to gain empathy and to understand them better. But I think this is also just as important because when you remember like birthdays or their favorite musicians, it makes them feel, again, important and encourages them to open up and feel safe in the classroom and just build a more personal relationship with them in that sense.
Yeah, we're gonna when we talk about creating a sense of belonging in classroom organization and management, I'm going to get back into that idea too. I don't think it can be understated enough that those kinds of connections and relationships are really game changers in terms of how our students interrelate with us. So thank you for that. Okay, so we have 4 tonight. Remember that you're going to do 2 during the course of the semester, so make sure that you are ready when we do our IQs and our IQ karaoke. So we talked a bit about multicultural literature in our discussion, and it's what brings the people of a particular group into focus. It can help students realize that in spite of our differences, all people share many common emotions, dreams, and hopes for the future. Through our interactions with characters representing a variety of cultures, young people begin to be members of a parallel culture, parallel cultures as unique and yet have universal feelings and experiences. So I think that the more we can bring in aspects of multicultural literature and examples, then we're giving the opportunity of our kids to make connections. And I ask, does it matter? Well, when Black Panther came out, there was a teacher in New York who took his 7th grade class on a field trip to see it. And then when he got them back into school, he asked them to make a comment about it. And I think the comments are interesting and speak for themselves. Well, the film inspires me to go explore Africa and make me want to build my own Black Panther suit. Remember, they're little kids, they're 7th graders. I want to see things they have to offer in Africa. After all, the media doesn't show the good. We see Africa as a third world country, but it's probably so much more. To see a Black person control a whole country and creating this technology really made me feel I could do more with my brain. It reminds me about the time white people would question my tail because of my skin. So these are just insights that kids have based upon seeing a movie. You can imagine the impact in a school setting where you begin to see yourself more explicitly in the curriculum. And again, language has funny aspects to it in terms of regional or dialectal or wherever you are. When I was working in Jackson, Mississippi, I was finishing up a workshop and I was just reorganizing the classroom I was in, and custodian walked in, elderly Black gentleman, and he said to me this. He said, "Kia de yet?" And I said, "Pardon me, I didn't get what you said." He said, "Dia, kia de yet?" And then I recognized that it was the first day of deer hunting season. and you want to know if I'd killed myself a deer yet. And then a kid from Oklahoma who came to me when I was a dean, I had to do an intake on it. And the first question he asked me was, "Y'all give licks here?" Now, some of you will know what that means. Others of you might not. But, you know, a lick is a spanking. And, you know, whack. And I said, well, actually, when I started as a dean, we did. I never did, but some people did. But actually, we quit doing that. But it was sort of interesting to see that. If there's any one kid who deserved it, it would have been him, by the way. So another question that comes up when we talk about this whole idea or myth of standard English, the question is, should students from minority backgrounds learn to use standard English? The question is a rhetorical one, as teachers, our stance toward the use of standard American English is critical. SAE is often thought of as the new news broadcast type of English used in the conduct of business, is the language of the dominant mainstream culture in the U.S. society, the culture of power, according to Lisa Delpit. She explains that the rules and codes of the culture of power, including rules and codes of language use, are acquired by students from mainstream backgrounds through interaction with their families, typically. Now, when we talk about standard English, it's kind of a myth because the only time you actually have a standard format of English is either in a formal presentation or a newscast, perhaps, what they call it newscast language, or a speech, or in writing, which I think is the big neutralizer in terms of whether or not standard English is acquired. There was a program that came out in around 1976 called Bridges to Reading. It was created by 3 African-American educators, and the program was designed to transition African-American speakers of dialect into a standard English form. And it was an interesting proposition. I was kind of curious to follow up on it, so I actually taught the program for a while. But the problem was twofold. One is that the stories that they told, like they took Little Red Riding Hood, for example, and they put it into an African-American dialect. But the story changed to being a young lady who had to walk through the parks where there were winos, which, made no sense to me. And then the idea would be to transition from a dialectal version to a less dialectal version to a standard form. But what was interesting is that when I asked the kids what they thought about it, one student said to me, "Well, it sounds like the language is too old." He said, I expect that they're going to use the word daddy-o in some place. I thought, that was really interesting because the language is so mutable, it changes all the time, and you can't expect it to be static. So the program, it kind of was a noble idea at the time, but it didn't really take hold for good reason. Okay? We already did our karaoke here. So this is a young lady who has an interesting perspective, and I thought I'd share this with you. She's a 9th grade student.
You don't talk right. You sound funny. Why are you speaking as though you're uneducated? For many African Americans, including myself, these sentences are merely common everyday occurrences. Maybe they say "cuz" instead of "because," or maybe they say "ax" instead of "ask." But it's something that we've all grown up hearing. And if hip-hop is the most popular genre of music, why is this shaming of African Americans still prevalent in society? And what if I were to tell you that this was merely an innovation of the English language? Well, maybe that's true. Firstly, let's give this dialect of speech a name. AAVE, the acronym for African American Vernacular English, formerly known as Ebonics. To understand just how this came to be, we must first look at the 17th century plantations during the colonial periods, as slavery had just arisen in the Americas. Oftentimes, families were torn apart and those who spoke the same language were separated. So many slaves who were illiterate at the time had to pick up the language of those around them. This is why AAVE reflects the English grammatical system as well as is a dialect of English language. And it is also the only dialect of English that is not native to a specific region of users, with New England accents coming from the New England region, Bay Area accents coming from, well, the Bay Area, and yes, what I'm sure you're all quite familiar with here in Georgia, the lovely Southern accent. However, this took a change in the 1950s and 1960s with what is referenced by many historians as the Great Migration. The Great Migration references a period in which many African Americans left the sharecropping South in pursuit of factory jobs westward in cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, as well as northwards with cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and even Boston. And the language moved with them, and as many became more educated and were able to write, this dialect took on a written form. Here are some everyday phonetics of AAVE, and you might even know some of your own personally. As I did state, it is found in popular culture and in many of the songs you may listen to currently. Firstly, there is a dropped L sound in words like help becoming hep, and there is a dropped R sound in words like your becoming yo, and the suffixes are also relatively different. The TH sound often becomes a CH sound in words like with, and the SK sound becomes a KS sound in words like ask becoming ax. Here are some of my favorite uses of AAVE. When you first get home and you're putting up the groceries and you say, I'll put both of them on the counter. When you need to call back that relative and you say, I'm gonna call her later. And yes, my favorite, when your grandmother's picking on you and your mother says, leave that poor child alone. AAVE is especially predominant in hip-hop, rap, as well as R&B, with many artists using it as a way to associate with their culture. AAVE oftentimes helps to form a sense of identity. However, many people say that AAVE is simply a degradation of music, and some have even been quoted to have said that hip-hop has done more damage in recent years to African Americans than racism in recent years. However, as some shame its use, others applaud it, with Kendrick Lamar Duckworth, professionally known as Kendrick Lamar, winning a Pulitzer Prize for his 5th studio album. The Pulitzer Prize is usually awarded to those who are jazz musicians or classical musicians, but Kendrick Lamar made history in 2017 when he became the first hip-hop musician to receive such an accreditation. Kendrick Lamar, of his piece, was recorded by the judging committee to have said that it was a virtuistic collection of vernacular authenticity of the African American experience and hardships. Kendrick Lamar can have been quoted to have said in the song, and if Anthony killed Ducky, Top Dog will be serving life while I grew up without a father and died in a gunfight, which is in his song entitled Duckworth, his homage to his family name and how many circumstances led him to become who he was with his newfound success. So, as you can see here, and if Anthony killed Ducky replaces the verb killed, dropping off the ed suffix, Top Dog will be serving life. You can see that the G is dropped off in the word serving, becoming serving. And while I grew up without a father and died in a gunfight, the D being dropped off of the word died. And although there are a lot of irregularities in this, Kendrick Lamar has been known to take on many, many adverse topics, ranging from police brutality to belief in a higher power such as a god, and even depression. Furthermore, as previously stated, there is a relevancy of Black identity in the songs, with them being the most popular artists of the genre. And this is a lot of the reason why you can play a lot of songs with sampling or even old hits, because streaming is so common nowadays. You can hear your dad say, "Girl, what you know about this?" A second aspect of AAVE that greatly differs from that of Standard English, the most common dialect of English, is the use of double negatives. Double negatives, an example of this would be, I don't have nothing. I don't have nothing in Standard English says, I have something. The two negatives canceling one another out, simply like in math. However, I don't have nothing in AAVE is a reaffirmation of the statement, I don't have anything. Reaffirmation works in English typically as the word very, in Spanish as the word muy, and in French as the word très. And no, I've never seen a French class in my life. This was patented by Robert Loth, who was an English professor who attended Oxford, and he was a prominent figure of the Catholic Church, and he wrote the novel A Short Introduction to English Grammar with critical notes. And this took a lot of influence around the 18th century, as linguistic structure came to be. Notable users of the double negatives include Shakespeare and Chaucer, who are currently literary greats, and I've just completed reading Romeo and Juliet in my 9th grade literature class, and believe it or not, he did in fact do this. And it can be quoted in Richard III, where he has been quoted to have said, "I never was nor never will be." However, I think a lot of teachers might have a problem with the statement of Coolio, "Ain't no party like a West Coast party, 'cause a West Coast party don't stop." Another aspect of AAVE innovating and adding to the English language is its use of tenses. Now, in English, as well as a few other languages, including Spanish, there are 3 main tenses outside of the infinitive. These are past, present, and future tense. But in AAVE, there is what is referenced as an occasional tense, which is not currently found in the English language as we know it. However, I will give an example of such. Using the verb to swim. The past tense of to swim in AAVE is he swam. The present tense, he swimmin'. The future tense, he gon' swim. And he be swimmin' works as an occasional tense, translating in standard English to he swims occasionally. Now, you may argue that you just said he swims occasionally. There was no AAVE there. However, you have to change the verb that is being used in that sentence for that conjugation to work as such. Here, I can use A$AP Ferg, who is currently a part of the rap group A$AP Mob, where he's quoted to have said, "Fergie be mobbin' all day," where an occasional tense is used. And I don't exactly know what mobbin' means, but sure does sound cool in the car. Furthermore, what I'd like to conclude from the use of AAVE in English language is that it adds a cultural importance to many of its users, as when African Americans originally arrived in the Americas, there wasn't a lot of culture for us to have after it was written for centuries after centuries. Furthermore, it gives us a reclamation of our heritage and our culture, and we can help identify with those who use it as well. Furthermore, it influences popular culture in hip-hop, R&B, and rap, as according to Billboard, it's the most popular genre of music by sales and downloads. I would also like to add that AAVE should not be seen as degrading of the English language, because just like any other language, it adds to how people connect to one another. It also has its own sense of grammatical structures and how words can be used, and many people who identify and use AAVE can hear exactly when it's being used improperly. Thus, if you were to compare Tagalog to Dutch to German or any other language that I might have failed to mention thus far, it's simply unfair because each language was made uniquely by its own unique users for its own unique purposes. And that should apply to any dialect of English or any dialect of language or any language. Thank you.
So it's interesting. The reason why I think this is important is because the dialect of English that is an African American vernacular is still English, but oftentimes it carries with it the burden of being thought of as deficient or deficits. And we know that for kids who come up in a household where that vernacular is predominant, that there are certain interference points that challenge them when it comes to the acquisition of standard English in terms of not speaking, but in terms of writing. And researchers have isolated various interference points, some of which the young lady shared as well. But again, minority students, however, whose families are outside the mainstream culture, don't acquire the same rules and codes because of a lack of exposure. If students are going to have access to opportunities in mainstream society, schools must acquaint students from minority backgrounds with the rules and codes of culture of power. Not making standard American English accessible to students from minority backgrounds puts them at a disadvantage in competing with their mainstream counterparts. But we have to give consideration to how we do this. So in terms of the students that I was teaching when I was in the inner city, the problem they had was that they had to take a standard form of text in standard English, transpose it to a dialectal understanding, and then transpose it back to standard English. So there's one more additional step that they have to use in terms of unlocking the meaning, and it can be challenging. So when we model good English, what I mean by that is more of a standard form of English where it's academic English, and we're giving kids an opportunity. But also, if we continue to habitually correct kids all the time for their language, then they're going to become more reticent. And I always tell the little story about the kid who raises his hand and says, "Teacher, I ain't got no pencil." And the teacher says, no, wait a minute. I don't have a pencil. You don't have a pencil. We don't have pencils. They don't have pencils. Now, do you understand? And the student says, what's been happening to all the pencils? Right? Same type of idea. So we want kids to be accepted in terms of the language variety that they bring to class, with the goal of not changing it, but with the idea of giving them options. Again, when we talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, it must provide a way for students to maintain their cultural integrity while succeeding academically. Students should not have to negotiate between who they are and how they identify to be successful in our classroom. This means we don't shame or punish them for expressing their identities. We don't limit their exposure to only texts that do not provide them with a range of representation. We do not punish them for showing emotion or expressing developmentally appropriate behavior. Instead, we realize that brilliance can show up in all kinds of ways when we make space. We take seriously our work of truly knowing and loving our students, understanding that such acceptance and love encourages them to be their academic best. And, back when I was teaching high school and middle school, I would oftentimes see teachers try to correct students' oral language. And the kids just shut down. So I think it's important to acknowledge this. And again, when we're discussing information with our students, the question comes up, should students speak in their vernacular? And I think the conversation goes two ways. I always encourage kids to speak up no matter what. And when they speak in a vernacular, I'm going to model my responses using more of a standard form to make sure that they understand that there are options in the dialogue. Now, there was again, what we know of it, again, and this goes to the achievement gap, is that poor and minority students are only 16% proficient compared to 42% of general population, and that's by fourth grade. So now we talked about fourth grade reading scores dropping by 5 points, so this is going to even be more significant in the coming years. The other thing is discipline can play its part too, according to another Stanford study. It linked the achievement gap between black and white students to the fact that the former are punished more harshly for similar misbehavior, for example, being more likely to be suspended from school than the latter. And this adds a whole new other aspect to the issue in terms of our lack of understanding of different communication styles and gestural styles that diverse groups bring to our classrooms. So there's a program that started in LA several years ago. It's called the Academic English Mastery Program. And it's mainly in elementary schools with some in middle schools as high as 6th grade. But the program is designed to teach students what we call a contrast analysis between the home language or the home variety in both African American, Latino, Hispanic families, and Native American and Native Hawaiian. Because a lot of the characteristics of language interference are similar in a lot of different ways. So the programs began by an educator, and I'm going to show you a little video clip that came up on one of the PBS shows. Let me know, by the way, if you can't hear it.
Minority students will need to be, in effect, bilingual. PS 100 in Watts is one of 60 schools using an experimental program called Academic English Mastery.
Okay.
I need all groups to pay attention. Cloyd, I need your focus now. And Gerardo.
Daniel Russell uses a game of Jeopardy to teach his grade 5 class how to translate their home language into mainstream American.
Okay, here we go. My grandpa cooked dinner every night.
Third person singular. Cooks. My grandpa cooks dinner every night.
Which linguistic feature is not in mainstream American English?
Third person singular.
Yes.
Yes.
And Marisol, How do you code switch this into mainstream American English?
My grandpa cooks dinner every night.
You just got 500 more points. He funny.
He is funny.
Okay, Ariel Baron, what's the answer?
He is funny.
He is funny? Excellent translation. Here we go. We don't have nothing to do. Okay, quiet please.
We don't have nothing to do.
Oh, I'm sorry. That is not, I'll wait. That is not accurate translation in mainstream American English. So you're at minus 400. So let me roll. Let's see which team will have an opportunity to get it. I might roll you guys again. 1.
Anything. We don't have anything to do.
Excellent translation.
I think perhaps the biggest misunderstanding is the idea that we are somehow teaching African American language, teaching Ebonics, if you will. We don't need to teach African American language.
Because they come speaking
They already know it. Our task is to help move them towards mastery of the language of school in its oral and written form, but to do that in a way where they are not devalued or where they feel denigrated in any way by virtue of their cultural and linguistic differences. Because when you begin to devalue youngsters and make them feel that who they are doesn't count, then we turn them off from education.
Last night, we baked cookies.
No, it's past tense.
Are you ready? Okay, number 1, what language is it in?
AAL.
It is an African American language. Number 2, what linguistic feature is in AAL?
Past tense marker, ED.
Past tense marker ED, that's 2. And how do you code switch it into mainstream American English?
Last night we baked cookies.
You got 500 more points. Is it too easy or I just taught you well this year?
Students in the program show significant gains in written English. Those behind it believe that unless more teachers treat home language as sympathetically, they'll condemn more generations to school failure. Language remains a formidable frontier in the legacy of slavery.
So you think the kids were into the lesson? I think they were into it, right? Yeah, but again, the idea is not about eradicating or changing their language. It's about giving them another option. And they also go into a lot of writing in the program as well. Okay, I want to just share with you a few terms so that you're aware of these ideas here. First of all, when we talk about standard English, we talk about the language that's usually typified by writing, but is sometimes referred to as cast language or newscaster speak. And again, language differences should not be mistaken for language deficits. Also, while we say that we think we speak standard English, oftentimes what we're really reflecting is what's referred to as an idiolect. In other words, our own idiosyncratic way of speaking. It's an individual's pattern of speech that's really unique to that person. And the one thing that we think about too is that we're able to code shift depending upon the situation that we're in, where sometimes when we're having casual talk, it will be anything but standard English, but when we're in a formal setting, whether it's a job interview or doing a presentation, or in an academic setting, we're likely to have speech that is more of a resemblance of a standard form. Now, dialect is a speech pattern that has been adopted by a group of people but spoken by at least 2 and may be confused with accent. Dialect is rule governed and consistent regionally and also nationally consistent. And I think this is important because I've been in situations where teachers view students' speech patterns as being, they speak of it derisively. And, you know, I have teachers who say, why can't these kids speak right? Why do they always speak in slang, right? So slang again, is a variation of language that adapts language and can be situational and creative, and is sometimes confused with dialect. And then two aspects of adolescence are, first of all, adolescents probably use more slang terms than anybody else, any other age group. And secondly, that there are more dialectal speakers of English in adolescence than there are in adults, when adults have more experience and become more formally acquainted with more of a standard form and can code shift depending upon situations. So those are some terms that we can be aware of here. Now, this is a little poem here that kind of puts you into the position of somebody who is confronted with a dialectal version of literature that with which you may be unfamiliar. So let's take a look at this for a second. Anybody want to try to translate it for us? I'll give you a second to read it over. Is it a little confusing? Anybody have any kind of angle on it? Okay, so let me shelter it for you a little bit. This is a poem that's in Hawaiian Pidgin, another dialect of English. Anybody care to try to read it? Well, let me suggest to you it might be helpful if I put on my best 8th grade acting voice and read it to you as you follow along, and then we'll see if we can make any kind of interpretation. I'll grab my Mai Tai here and just get ready to go. Okay. The poem's title is Try Look You Inside, which means try looking inside yourself. Okay? And it starts out when it says, small kid time, so much more pretty. It talks about when we were kids. So much more pretty. Not a mountain? Why you fella like scrape the mountain like that? Waste of time. Try to look one sunset. How you gonna look? Waste of time. So much building. You think you're more natural inside the box? Try to look you outside. Can't think straight with all these contraptions. Hard for breathe. He's talking about cars and how hard it is to breathe, these contraptions. You know why I get so many accidents? You make them, that's why. Try to look you and say, how much people's now? Maybe I should trouble. Maybe I'll stop making baby. By and by, their house broke. Try to look you outside, the trees, they won't forget. They'll can't find paradise outside. Outside where? Outside you. How can? Everything inside. That's like surfing, eh? When you get one good ride, that's living, eh? That's what you call inside. You won't forget love or what? That's the kind, you know what kind? Try to look you inside. So what is the poem saying to you now? Any indications of what you can come away with? Elizabeth?
I think it's kind of talking about like how everyone's very materialistic and like you should be looking inside yourself and like finding it says the one good ride of like surfing is like life, and you gotta look at it from the inside instead of the outside, I guess.
Is anybody hearing Elizabeth? You are, and I'm not. Okay, something's going on here. Okay, well, obviously my setting here is off somehow. But anyway, let me just go ahead here and show you the comparison between the Hawaiian Pidgin version and the more standard English version. You can just read them side by side and get an idea of what this is about here. And again, the poem is a protest poem over about the overdevelopment of the Hawaiian Islands, written by a fellow named Joe Hadley. So as you read it right on the right, you tend to make more sense out of it. But I thought it was interesting to kind of put you into the position that a dialectal speaker may feel sometimes in terms of how they can get confused easily. The other point I want to make is that sometimes even standard English will feel the same way. So here's a little science article about how caterpillars rearrange themselves into butterflies. And as you read through that, you can begin to think about the different challenges that a student would have in terms of accessing this text and some of the ways in which we would have to scaffold it, particularly when it comes to some of the technical or academic vocabulary, the rare words that saturate this article. There's a tremendous amount of background knowledge that a student would need to know in order to make sense of this. And so it isn't just the fact that there are language variations, but language variations within a body of content can be challenging as well. If you just make a note of this in your 10th and 11th edition, there's a process called the SIOP, or Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. And what this is a way of instructional planning for working with second language learners. And what it is an observation protocol. The reason why I shared this with you is because if you consider the SIOP protocol in terms of how you look at it from an instructional planning viewpoint, it'll give you some ideas in terms of, obviously the objective here is if you are being evaluated in terms of how you're addressing your second language learner subgroups, that you would want to use the protocol as a way of instructional planning. But the reason I share this with you is because on the FRED and the NTPA, there are sections there that ask for specifics in terms of working with second language groups. So the SIOP protocol will feed you some ideas in terms of how to introduce instruction to match these groups, because that's one of the areas that people get dinged for the most on the FRED and the NTPA. So if you just kind of keep that in mind when you're doing your planning and how you have to have some narrative there, the SIOP protocol will help you. Okay. Another book that is a good resource for you is called 7 Principles of Culturally Responsive Teaching by Gary Howard. And it'll go into more in depth about culturally responsive teaching. And again, it's just another resource to hang out there in case you're interested in adding that to your library. Okay, if you would grab your reader and open it up to your keyword summarizer, we're going to finish tonight with an entry here on this square about culturally responsive teaching. Again, you'll find this in your reader on page 5. Okay, as you have your reader in your hand, would you open it up to page 92? You'll see an article there titled Putting Students on the Path to Learning. And this will be our IQ for next week. And I'll be emailing you the quick write for next week in a little bit after we close out our class.
Page 92, you said?
Page 92.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Putting students on the path to learning, yes.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close out tonight's broadcast. Once again, I look forward to seeing you. If you can get here as close to 7 o'clock as possible, that would be great, so we can get everybody tucked in and ready to go. And I'll be around for a few minutes for office hours. With that, I want to wish everybody a good night, and I look forward to seeing you next week, same time, Station 521, once again. Good night, everybody. Take care. Have a great week.
Good night.
Thank you.